Welcome to Bake to the Future. The wholesale baking industry mixes tradition and innovation to feed the world and the economy, generating some major dough while employing nearly 800,000 people in the U.S. We bring you a fresh take on the latest trends and issues impacting the baking sector through exclusive insights and conversations. Brought to you by the American Bakers Association, who will take you bake to the future.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Haley Blumenreich.
And I'm Katie Jewell.
And we are doing something a little different this week. This will be part 1 of 2 of our conversation with some heavyweights in the food industry to talk about how their members fared during the pandemic and what they see going forward. Robb MacKie, who we all know from the American Bakers Association, will join us along with Juliana Potts, President and CEO of the North American Meat Institute, and Michael Dykes, President and CEO of the International Dairy Foods Association. And being that the show is called Bake to the Future, we have mostly focused on the baking industry, but we wanted to get a first-hand account of other industries in the hopes that we can learn from each other's experiences.
From the beginning of the pandemic, we always knew there was going to be so much to unpack from all this, and our guests on today's show and their member companies have had to endure some hard times and tough headlines, which we'll talk about, but we will also be looking forward to talking about some silver linings as we continue providing the country a safe, steady supply of food. And about our guest today, Juliana Potts is the president and CEO of the North American Meat Institute, known as NAMI. NAMI is a national trade association representing companies that process 95% of red meat and 70% of turkey products in the U.S. and their suppliers throughout America. Michael Dykes, Doctor of Veterinary Medicine, is President and CEO of the International Dairy Foods Association, or IDFA. His association represents members that make more than 85% of the milk, cultured products, cheese, ice cream, and frozen desserts produced and marketed in the U.S. And, of course, we all know Robb MacKie, ABA's President and CEO. As was mentioned in the podcast intro, our organization represents the nation's wholesale baking companies, which employ nearly 800,000 employees in the U.S. Hi, Robb.
Hi, Katie.
And welcome, Juliana and Michael.
Thank you for having us.
And it's not often that we have so many food industry CEOs in one virtual room. So therefore, our podcast today will be a bit of a CEO's forum, an open discussion. But before we start with the more serious topics, Katie and I'd like to start off the show with a few tough questions. Julie, we'll start with you. What is your favorite baked good that also incorporates meat?
Oh my. I'd have to say a hot dog and a hot dog bun. How about that? And I had several of them this past weekend.
That's a super good answer. Wow, it's like you wrote this little segment for us. Michael?
Mustard only. Only.
Oh,
okay. All right.
That's good to know. Yes. And Michael, what is your favorite baked good that involves dairy products?
Oh, dairy products, baked goods. I would have to say probably chocolate chip cookie.
Okay. Yeah.
That is a popular one among the staff at the ABA, so you are not alone.
And we've also had our last podcast guest. We asked her what her favorite baked good was, and it was a chocolate chip cookie. And she advocates for chocolate chip cookie and milk break every day at 3 p.m. So that's a nice pairing as well. And now, Robb, we already know that your favorite baked good is key lime pie, so we've got that part. But we want to throw another hardball question at you, and thank you, Juliana, for mentioning the hot dog. Robb, we wanted to think of something that includes meat and dairy and baked goods. So the question is a chili cheese dog a sandwich?
I'm going to say no. And here's why. Because if you didn't have the chili on it, it could be a sandwich because you would eat it with your hand. And maybe it's just me and the way I eat chili cheese dogs. But for me, that requires a knife and a fork. So therefore, it's a meal and not a sandwich.
Would definitely be a sandwich for me.
Interesting. Juliana, do you have any comments?
Tiebreaker.
Not a sandwich. Never a sandwich.
Yes.
Well, this is definitely part of our food debate controversies. And we actually polled our staff at the ABA, and results have shown that 75% of the ABA staff say no, it is not a sandwich, and 25% says say yes. So, the jury's still out, but definitely skewing no.
Well, I believe the state of New York does consider hot dogs a sandwich for taxation purposes. I don't know what standards of identity say, but we can have a whole discussion on standards of identity some other time. But for today, the format of the podcast is kind of a CEO roundtable approach, and we're going to kick it off with the first question. Robb's going to be kind of the leader of this roundtable. And so we'll start with you as I kick it off, as I kick it over. Robb, from the beginning of this crisis in the U.S., the entire food industry quickly rallied to ensure America's food supply was safe, plentiful. And I know that you, along with Juliana and Michael and a number of other folks, were in the virtual room where it happened. And so let's talk about that.
No, I think that's a great point, Katie. And I would just say that, there's a whole bunch of ironies and serendipities in this whole crazy environment that we've been in for, 6 months now. It's hard to believe. We actually have a group of CEOs that I have the great honor of facilitating. I wouldn't say lead because we have a great group of leaders. And Juliana and Michael are two of those great leaders of our group. We had our annual strategy session planned well before COVID really started to spin up. And so we actually got together as a group, and there was a lot of, conversations about how do we get our hands around this? Where is this going? What does the future look like? And, sort of looking back on that moment, I don't know that we would have guessed that A, it would have been this long, B, that it would have taken all of the twists and turns that we have taken along this path that we're on. But I do think it's really important right at the outset to say that I'm so pleased and really just very proud to work in the food and beverage industry, because when we got our group together in the very first days before we went virtual, we all agreed that the single mission that we had was to protect our employees while feeding the country, because there were a lot of other things. There was a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, and we saw the panic buying, which I'd like to talk a little bit more in depth about. But at the very beginning, we knew that we would play a vital role that would allow, our policymakers to do what they needed to do, to protect, the average American, as well as, develop the resources needing the testing, the PPE, all of the things that have come to pass. But again, I think the food industry, and it was one of those things with the great support and leadership of Michael and Juliana, that we just made the decision to step out and to invoke that critical infrastructure designation that goes back a number of years. And it was a case of asking for forgiveness and not for permission. So we want to walk through a couple of questions here and really kind of get things started. I know in the baking industry, the early days, the pictures of grocery store shelves without any baked products on it were a little unnerving. And yet when we were talking to our members, it was really a supply chain from a distribution and buying purchase, with consumers just literally hitting stores hard. Michael, I want to talk to you about, you had a little bit of a different situation where on the milk side, and let me say the news media made great hay out of this. And so there may be a story behind the story that most people aren't aware of. But Michael, that we saw also the videos of milk being poured out on the ground by dairy farmers at a time when there was huge demand by consumers, by American people. Can you tell us, what led to that process? Why did that happen? And what's the industry done since then to adapt?
Oh, thank you, Robb. Let me start with what happened to our dairy industry when the coronavirus kind of broke here in the U.S., if you will. Milk clearly is a perishable product, gets picked up off the farm every day, and the cows are milked 2 times, 3 times a day. So every day we've got another load, several more loads of milk coming at us. So what happened to us during the coronavirus? About 50% of our business in dairy is in the retail sector, and about 50% is in the food service sector. So almost overnight, we lost 50% of our business. And so we had a period of time where there was panic buying at the retail on milk, just as well as you said, about bread. but panic buying on milk. We had plenty of milk coming in off the farms. We had the ability to bottle the milk, but the problem we had is making the transition over the distribution, the logistics, the supply chain to get the milk from our bottlers over to the retail so that we can make that switch. And it took us a little while to make that happen. But we have been able to get that done. We've made it happen. We even had milk processors continue to take milk even though they had no outlet for their product, and to make product and inventory it for cheeses and other food service items just so farmers didn't have to dump their milk on the ground, and so they could keep all their employees employed, which is another phenomenon we had going on during the same time as we did the panic buying at the retail side.
No, that's interesting, Michael, because the ratio in the baking industry is almost identical. It's about 50% of the production was going to retail outlets, and about 50%, a little over 50%, was going to food service. And you make a great point that literally overnight, half of the business and the supply chain that goes with that disappeared. And so, I think it does take time for our respective industries to adapt to that new supply chain, rewire it, if you will, to make it work. Let me ask Michael, where do you see things progressing? Are you seeing, like we are a little bit in the baking side, are you starting to see a rebound, if you will, on food service? And how big is that? And what do you think that looks like, 6 months, a year from now?
Well, we saw on the food service side, it took a little while for that inventory to clear out on the food service side. Then back in the beginning of the summer, we saw restocking of the food service side. We saw an uptick in demand, but I would say that's kind of somewhat leveled off, if you would, Rob, as the virus kind of spreads more from the Northeast and PNW down to the Southeast and Southwest. That's kind of leveled off somewhat. Exports have been huge for us. So over this first 6 months of 2020 over the first 6 months of 2019, retail is still above normal. Food service is not back to what it was. Exports are larger than it was. We've seen volatility in the dairy markets that we've never ever seen before.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I want to hone in a little bit and bring Juliana into the conversation. The issue of trade. I mean, all three of our industries really rely, particularly in the North American sector, we really rely on an integrated supply chain. And obviously, with borders being closed and disruptions all over the place, I'm hoping that Juliana, how is the meat, and I'll bring Michael in too to answer on the dairy side. How have you been impacted, particularly with regards to Mexico and Canada and all the disruptions in terms of border trade?
Trade has been a bright spot for the meat industry throughout this whole situation, and the numbers have remained up. I think it's questions have been asked, as we've talked about. The fear that people here in the U.S. had about meat shortages, and the impact of trade on domestic supply. But so many of the kinds of things that people eat in other places, I'd say, thinking now about Asia, really provide an opportunity for meats that would not be consumed here to go somewhere else. And so we have seen incredible numbers throughout COVID, and really for our producers, for the producers of the cattle and the hogs, keeping those export markets robust has been, kind of the pathway out of the situation we've seen with COVID for many of the producers that have suffered such price declines because of the supply chain disruptions that you and Michael have already described. We certainly saw the same thing you describe in terms of food service and retail, and the impact that had on the meat side was very, very similar. And so keeping trade as part of the equation has been something that both the producers and the meat processors have had a united voice to advocate for.
I would say on the trade side, Rob, we've seen first 6 months of 2020 versus the first 6 months of 2019. We've seen a 14% increase in value of exports and a 12% increase in volume. China is running at the pace of 2x what it was same time period last year. That's largely because the Chinese is rebuilding its swine herd after African swine fever, and they purchase a lot of dairy products to go into swine feed. Mexico, cheese to Mexico is up over 60%. So it's turned out to be a good year for us from a export perspective. But the exports also pay back into the volatility. So as we went into this, cheese rough cuts $2 a pound. It takes about 10 pounds of milk to make a pound of cheese, so that's about $20 milk. Cheese was about $2 a pound. We hit a period of time in May, cheese got down to $1 a pound. And then we saw $3 cheese in July, all-time record prices for cheese. So when cheese is $1, we're the cheapest cheese supplier in the world. So our exports went up. Then when cheese is $3 a pound, we were probably the most expensive cheese in the world. So we'll see what our exports are in the second 6 months of 2020. But the extreme price volatility ties into the export markets as well. So that both the points, the most volatility we've seen in the marketplace ever, and our exports were extremely positive in the first 6 months of 2020.
Do you see that leveling out, Michael, in the second half of this year?
Oh yeah, this market will find equilibrium. It will level out. Also, the other thing to take into account, this being a global pandemic, New Zealand, which is a major dairy exporter, and the European Union, another major dairy exporter, we're experiencing some of the impacts of coronavirus as well.
That's interesting. That's my sense too. Is as we get further along, absent localized, regionalized spikes, both domestically and internationally, that we ought to see a leveling out. We're anticipating that the leveling out will be above what say 19 and more historical averages have been in the baking industry. But it's still anybody's guess at this point if that actually comes to fruition.
Well, if I could, Rob, if I could just make one point on that, I think that depends on the nature of your business. If you were a dairy processor and you had a significant portion of your business selling to food service, this would be a very tough year. Right. If you had a significant part of your business selling to retail, this would be a very good year. So I think it's going to depend on the nature of your business.
And we're definitely seeing that in the baking side, Michael. Our retail folks, and we kind of put them in three, general buckets. Retail, number of our members have said probably on path to have, a record year, unprecedented success. Our in-store bakery, which is the stuff that you buy in bulk. I mean, that essentially was shut down for a while. Now you can buy it, in a bulk package. And then clearly food service took an enormous hit. We had one of our board members who indicated they literally went from 100 miles an hour business to 20 miles an hour in literally 48 hours. And so, that kind of disruption and volatility takes a while to overcome. So I do want to switch because I know with our group, we have spent an enormous amount of time and effort interfacing with the White House, USDA, FDA, OSHA, and other agencies around this issue of workforce, because we all know all of the things that we're talking about, and fulfilling that commitment to feed the country doesn't happen without a safe and healthy workforce being able to come to work every day. And unfortunately, Julianne, I think you all ended up, at least in the media's eyes, in a really challenging situation with some of the reporting coming out But can you give us the real story behind? Well, first, let me ask you this, Juliana. What has their industry done in terms of protecting the workforce? And then what's the real story behind the headlines with some of the meat challenges that we saw, a month or so ago?
Sure. Really appreciate the opportunity to address it. It has the months of sort of late March all through April and most of May were among the most challenging. I think you talk to meat industry veterans who've been around for decades, and they say it's the most challenging time they ever lived through. Meat production is meat processing is a very labor intensive activity, still is, has been. Even with automation, there are activities in the fabrication area that are best done with humans. And so, as you said at the top of this, our primary objective in addition to producing food for people, was to keep our workforce healthy. So very early on, way before the headlines, talked about the number of COVID cases in the plants, our meat companies were trying to procure personal protective equipment, going so far as sending airplanes overseas to bring masks and face shields and things like that back before the CDC had given guidance that everyone should be wearing a mask. There were temperature checks very early on, communications about hand washing and those kinds of things. But as we learned more, and as we and you, Michael, and Rob were engaged in all of these conversations on behalf of the entire industry, we really begged for guidance from the CDC, from OSHA, from FDA, from USDA, and for assistance in how we both implement the kinds of controls that we needed to do in the plants, as well as help in discussing those things with local health officials and state health officials who were very concerned as they began to see more positives. I would say that a lot of it came down to communication with the workforce, multiple languages, multiple communities represented, ethnic and religious communities represented in our workforce, and going into those communities on a very local level was very, very important to the success of reducing the level of fear and also ensuring that COVID did not spread more throughout the plants. And so it was a long learning process, but I think will give us a lot of experience in as we go forward and we see spikes. I think you're not hearing the same kinds of headlines because there's a lot of knowledge and awareness now of how to keep workers safe and from spreading the virus amongst themselves and in the communities. Proper spacing has also been implemented. Controls like shields in between, plexiglass or even stainless steel shields in between workstations. Spacing in donning and doffing areas and in hallways. All of that has been done and was done over the months of April and May.
I think it was literally week one where we got together as a food and beverage industry, and we realized that the wheels of government, even in the best case of scenario, just take a while to move, to get up to speed. And I can remember that we were working week one, all of us together from across the food and beverage industry were working on a protocol and to get, how do you operate safely? How do you, protect those employees, but then also keep plants operational, again, to meet both sides of the mission that we face during the COVID pandemic. And literally, we're pulling from best practices from across our various industry sectors, and eventually, government agencies were able to catch up, if you will. And I don't mean to sound remotely disrespectful, But it was, those were the very early days. And, we were all getting calls from our members, looking for that kind of information and data. And I think we have been very flexible, again, as a broad food and beverage industry, to adapt and update as new learnings have come on board. And I just don't know that people really appreciate how much that came together and how quickly it came together. And again, I think it shows the mission of protecting our employees first. Michael, what kinds of workplace issues have your members been dealing with during the pandemic?
I would say much the same as Juliana talked about, Rob. We've been doing the temperature checks. We've been doing education. We've been our workers are probably a little more spaced out. If we weren't running 3 shifts a day, such that we had the opportunity to extend some of the shifts so we could go with fewer workers and still get the product made, we did some of those kinds of things. Mask, make sure we had PPE for our workers was all part of the protocol. I think that has transitioned somewhat, Rob, now to educating about gatherings, and probably one of the places where, as we talk to our members, especially to the chief human resource officers, the weekends, especially with summer and family reunions, pose significant issues for positive tests and quarantine and those kind of things after the weekends.
Yeah, I think that's a big challenge that, it's so hard after being literally cooped up for months on end. Families want to get together. They want to do their celebrations, weddings, and unfortunately, in some cases, funerals and things like that, just getting together. And that still has to be done in a very safe environment. Otherwise, the food, speaking just to the food manufacturing, those industries get, exposed potentially. And I think we're starting to see, through some of the contract tracing information, we're starting to see some recognition that we have to just stay very vigilant as we go forward.
Well, that concludes part 1 of this 2-part series with food industry CEOs Juliana Potts from NAMI and Michael Dykes from IDFA and Robb MacKie from ABA. On the next episode, which will be out on August 25th, 2020, hear the rest of our conversation about innovations on the horizon, health and nutrition trends, and importance of food supply safety and how their industries are tackling food insecurity and the school meals programs.
We are starting a new segment on the show called The Great Bake Debate, where we poll you all, our listeners, on a baked good related food debate. Just like we asked our guests at the top of the show if a chili cheese dog is a sandwich, we will be asking equally tough or even tougher questions. And our next question will be, what is the proper way to cut a sandwich? In half, creating 2 rectangles, or diagonally, creating 2 triangles? We want to hear from you, so go to baketothefuture.org/debate to submit your answer, and we will announce the results at the next show. And on Bake to the Future, we try to bring you a look at the future from all angles. So if you have an idea for a show, let us know. You can leave a voicemail at baketothefuture.org or send us an email at hello@americanbakers.org.
Bake to the Future is brought to you by the American Bakers Association in partnership with Human Factor. To hear upcoming and past episodes, go to baketothefuture.org. Bake to the Future is produced by Haley Blumenreich. Audio engineer is Blake Alton. And A Slice of the Action is written by the American Bakers Association's Government Relations team.